rifles, and on top of that, you were required to have a shooter's license issued by each state government after you've done a preliminary test, and that's obviously held against a harmonised set of registers across Australia, and that, I understand, is what is feared most in some ways, having both a shooter's licence scheme and a weapons registration scheme, the two big asks here in Australia. They were legislated for within the 12 months following the massacre at Port Arthur, adopted along with a gun buyback scheme, and the result is plain to see and cannot be denied by the NRA.
Well, and tell us about that gun buyback, because we've had gun buybacks in the United States, but this was a mandatory national gun buyback.
Involving about $500 million, involving a added levy. It greatly reduced accidental deaths by guns, and homicide deaths and suicide deaths.
But there must have been people in Australia who did not sell back their guns, people that maybe shouldn't have even had their guns in the first place, whether they be criminals or whatever.
No legislation that can be adopted without someone breaking the law, and some have been apprehended in breaking the law. But it made a difference in two ways. Essentially, it did take out the semi-automatics, the oversized, overpowered weapons from the suburbs of Australia. It also caused people to think, well, do I really need a gun? If I do, I'll apply and get it, but if I don't really need it, I won't go down that pathway. And so we really did walk away from a policy of more and more guns. And we did so, perhaps recalling some of the comments that many have made, including Wendy Whitmire from the gun control group Mums Demand Action in the USA. If more guns made us safer, the US would be the safest nation in the world. You are not. You are 10 to 15 times more likely to be shot dead in the USA per capita than Australia. And by the way, you are even safer in Italy than the USA with regard to guns when looked at like for like on a per capita basis.
We're speaking with Tim Fischer, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. Tim Fischer, one of the things you did was add a 28-day waiting period for people who wanted to buy guns. Tell us about that.
It was a cooling off period. It was the complete opposite of having no background checks at gun shows. And if the US was to do anything, surely it should reinstate that and stand up to the NRA, which risks being completely put offside with its own supporters and the community at large the next time a massive gun massacre occurs. You've got to face down such bad anomalies as there being no background check whatsoever for anyone who wants to rock up to a gun show. It just builds and builds the number of guns around, and it has led indeed to people carrying guns still being killed in shootouts.
But I can hear a gun control advocate listening to this and saying, well, it's easier said than done. In this country, there's such opposition to that. There's a strong feeling by gun owners and even non-gun owners that people should have a right to bear arms in this country, and that anything that infringes on that is against the Constitution. How did you manage to overcome that hurdle in Australia to the extent that the same feelings exist there?
Jeremy, that's a good question, and we took the debate to the public square. We stood up at meeting after meeting, John Howard, Prime Minister, myself as Deputy Prime Minister and leader of a party with particular membership from country areas, and members and senators from country areas, including many from Queensland, went to meeting after meeting, and that's the only way you'll turn the tide. That, and sadly, a massacre that goes beyond the pale, a massacre that hits up towards 100 dead. No intelligent person can justify allowing no check whatsoever for people to buy guns in the 21st century.
But were you worried for your own political future by getting up and standing up in those town meetings and saying what you did?
Yes, it was tough, and we had a swing against the government at the subsequent elections for a couple of reasons, of which guns was probably not one of those reasons, all things considered. But yes, I was bitterly attacked. I was directly attacked. I was hung in effigy. Some said Look, you're a Vietnam veteran, Tim Fisher. You're a rancher or farmer background. You, above all, should be defending our rights to unrestricted size of weapons, number of weapons, and a laissez-faire approach on guns. I am a Vietnam veteran. I weighed the pros and cons and supported John Howard and the harmonised legislation because I could see this was Australia's chance to jump through the hoops, take some pain, withdraw private property from individuals but pay them just compensation. The result is there for everyone to see. On any calculation, at least 10 times, and on some calculations, up to 15 times safer than the streets of the USA and places like Duncan, Oklahoma, where a young Australian jogging along peacefully was cut down and slaughtered by guns in the USA not so long ago.
And we should remind people, by the way, that you are a gun owner even to this day.
Yes, I am, happily, and use a gun on the farm, and not so much for recreational reasons, but for essential reasons, with livestock needing to be put down and rabbit and fox control, and so be it. I am a happy owner of guns, a rancher down under, a Vietnam veteran, but one that fully supports the harmonised laws that have made a huge difference here in Australia, made Australia so much safer than the USA, who still has this incredible circumstance where you can have no background checks applied to a person buying a gun, almost any kind of gun, at a gun show in the USA.
Tim Fisher is a former member of the Australian Parliament, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, speaking to us via Skype from his ranch in Australia. Tim Fisher, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you indeed.
And we'd love to hear from you after Roseburg. What should be done in this country? Can anything get done? You can go to hereandnow.org and leave us a message there, or send me a tweet at Jeremy Hobson.
Kids in Distress has supported more than 100,000 families in its 36-year history. You can help KID provide services to at-risk families by joining the Butterfly Effect monthly giving program. A small monthly donation can change a child's future. Information at kidinc.org.
This is Terry Gross, the host of Fresh Air. I love interviewing actors, authors, musicians, newsmakers. I also love when listeners get to hear the interviews with as few interruptions as possible. If you make your contribution to WLRN before October 14th, you can help end the Fall Pledge campaign before it even begins. So make your donation by calling 866-247-9576 or by visiting WLRN.org. Thank you. Hello, it's Bonnie Berman. Join us for Wednesday's Topical Currents when we revisit the status of the Florida Everglades. We'll hear from the federal government's Senior Director of the Everglades Restoration Initiative, Shannon Estenos. That's Topical Currents, Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston. MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. And Brigham and Women's Hospital, where real-time multimodality imaging is being studied to improve precision in surgery. This operating room can be seen at brighamandwomens.org/precision. Brigham and Women's Hospital, life giving breakthroughs.
This is Here and Now from NPR and WBUR. I'm Jeremy Hobson. A fight between a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature in Illinois has led to almost 100 days without a budget. The state now has a backlog of more than $6 billion of unpaid bills. State funding for public universities has been cut off. State museums have been closed, and now even 911 call centers are in the mix. Tony Arnold covers Illinois politics for WBEZ in Chicago. And Tony, what a mess.
What a mess. I mean, this is really affecting almost everything from the 911 call centers to STD testing that is being affected here by this budget impasse.
Well, tell us about the 911 call centers, because a lot of people are going to be quite shocked that that would be something that could be affected by a budget stalemate.
Right. 911 centers are funded through a tax on cell phones in Illinois, and what's going on is that the taxes are still being collected on cell phones. Money's coming in, but it's not going out because a budget hasn't been approved by the legislature or the governor to tell the state where to spend that money. So 911 centers have been sitting here dipping into their own reserves because they haven't been paid. They're saying we may have to lay people off. That means fewer people to answer the phones when someone calls 911, which means potentially longer wait times for anyone who calls 911.
And you mentioned also funding for STD testing not going out there, and we talked about the universities, the public universities in Illinois, not getting a dime of state funding for months.
Right. Yeah, universities are dipping into their own reserves, talking about tuition increases with STD testing. The departments of public health, the local departments, aren't being able to get reimbursed for sending their samples along to the state. Usually that's been free. We're hearing all sorts of stories about English as a second language not being funded, mental health organizations, training for police officers, even lottery winners haven't been paid.
And the governor, Bruce Rauner, the Republican governor, says he's not backing down in this budget fight with the Democratic legislature. What is at issue here? Well, what can't they agree on?
The governor says that he's holding out for budget-related issues. He says these things are budget-related. He's talking about making workers' compensation more selective, cutting down on the number of civil lawsuits filed or tort reform, putting in term limits on legislators. But at the heart of it, a lot of what he's talking about is really anti-union proposals to limit collective bargaining, that type of thing. Democrats say that he has this obsession that the governor has with undermining unions, and that a lot of these issues aren't related to this budget at all, and this is all kind of a distraction.
How long can this fight go on?
There's really no end in sight. There's a few line of thoughts of when this might end, what could prompt this. One is that the state, as you said before, is running out of money. And so the one thing that they actually did pass a budget for is keeping the schools open. But there's been many lawsuits and court orders saying the state has to pay for payroll. No, you have to pay for foster care. You have to pay for Medicaid. These are judges saying this, telling the state they have to do this. So a lot of money is still going out the door, but they might not even have the money to pay for what they actually budgeted for, schools. So there might come a time when these two things cross and schools start not getting paid. That could prompt action. Another thing is, honestly, a lot of people are kind of sitting around thinking there might be some sort of tragedy because we're talking about police training that's getting cut, English as a second language,
911 call centers.
911 call centers. There might be a tragedy that actually spurs some kind of action from the politicians. But in the meantime, there really doesn't seem to be any sort of political will to get the two sides together.
Tony Arnold, who covers Illinois politics for WBEZ in Chicago. Tony, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And we'll continue to follow the Illinois budget crisis here and now.
On the next morning edition, how to fix a public relations disaster. The image of Volkswagen flipping from Herbie the Love Bug to sneaky polluter.
You've got to go through CEO firings, lawsuits, congressional hearings. These are all of the rituals that you have to survive.
I'm David Green. Some free advice for Volkswagen from crisis managers. That's on the next morning edition.
I'm Sharon Brody. Moscow says it is willing to resume talks on ways to avoid warplanes interfering with each other in the skies over Syria. Earlier today, the U.S. Defense Secretary called on Russian defense officials to contact the Pentagon immediately to discuss their escalating military activities in Syria. The governor of California has signed a measure that gives female workers in the state new tools to challenge gender-based wage gaps. Supporters say the law offers the strongest equal pay protection in the U.S.
It's 11:39.
Jaw-dropping entertainment, says the Miami Herald. You can see what's been described as an astonishing modern circus when the stage comes alive with acrobats, breakdancers, and contortionists in Cirque El Waz ID at the Arsh Center, October 8th through the 11th. The Miami New Times says ID stunts will make you gasp and jump. Everyone should love this fusion of theatrical circus and urban dance. Cirque El Waz ID, October 8th through the 11th. Tickets at arshcenter.org. We're funded by WLRN members and by City National Bank, dedicated to redefining banking by providing personal relationships, local decisions, and best-in-class service. City National Bank. More information at citynational.com.
Funding for Here and Now comes from WBUR Boston. Curious.com, committed to helping people learn more than 17,000 skills, like Russian, retirement planning, and rock climbing. Curious.com, grow your skills. Learn more at curious.com/NPR. And TIAA-CREF, a global financial company dedicated to delivering financial outcomes that matter. TIAA-CREF, created to serve, built to perform. Learn more at TIAA.org. It's Here and Now. Let's turn now to Canada and the Canadian military. As fighting in northern Afghanistan heats up again, it's worth noting that until last year, Canada had soldiers there. Also, Canada is part of the U.S.-led coalition fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So the idea of military cooperation between the two countries is not really new. In fact, it was the subject of a 1968 movie called The Devil's Brigade, the story of a joint U.S.-Canadian unit in World War II.
Major Crown, sir. Canadian Army. Reports for duty. Glad to have you with us, Crown.
Well, now we have this surprising piece of news from the CBC. The Canadian military has been in talks with the U.S. to integrate their country's military forces today. CBC reporter James Cudmore broke the story and joins us now. And James, what sort of military cooperation are we talking about?
Well, Magna, you set the stage quite nicely talking about the cooperation that Canada and the U.S. have embarked upon in places like Afghanistan. There's also, of course, and by way of more context, the NORAD piece, which is really important in the defense of North America, which is effectively an integrated aerospace defense unit, both Canadian and American. That's kind of the model for what was being discussed and planned inside Canadian and American military headquarters. We know that Canada's Chief of the Defense Staff at the time, General Tom Lawson, met on several occasions with your Chair of the Joint Chiefs at the time, General Martin Dempsey, to discuss, and I quote here, fully integrated forces. This was one of several different options that was being looked at. This was conceptual development, according to some military documents that I got a hold of, that deal with different manners in which we could do a better job of working with one another.
Let me just jump in here because, you know, the difference between military parlance and lay parlance can be quite dramatic. Fully integrated, meaning what?
That's a great question. Fully integrated, what does it mean? So there were a couple different options on the table. At the extreme end was this idea of forces being unified under a single chain of command with single accountabilities and responsibilities, a regulated kind of arrangement, documented, an MOU signed, agreements, everybody's governments agreeing to this process. That is something that would look very much like that Devil's Brigade idea, the First Special Service Force of a joint unit. And that would be the entire force. Now, when we're talking about numbers, you should bear in mind that Canada's military is quite small in comparison to the United States. Our force is only about the size, in fact less than the size, of your Marine Force, and that's all of them, our Air Force, our Navy, and our Army. So the idea of Canada kind of melding into a U.S. force does make some kind of sense, apart from the fact that we're separate countries. There's the rub, right? So there were a couple of other options that were being discussed, which included maybe just something like a joint expeditionary unit to deploy abroad to certain hotspots. And that would be kind of a standing force, but not truly integrated, not one unit commanded by one person. It would be more like an agreed idea of how we might operate abroad. And then a third option was just how can we keep the lessons that we learned fighting alongside one another in Afghanistan going. And it appears that that's really the option that the two forces, yours and ours, landed on.
So James, this is interesting though, because, you know, on the
one hand, perhaps greater cooperation or even integration between the United States and Canadian militaries might make strategic sense when considering, North American operations, right? I mean, you talked about NORAD, but here you're reporting that, the discussions were what the lessons that we take from Afghanistan in foreign hotspots. But on the other hand, though, I also read that while you said that the heads of both the U.S. and Canadian militaries were in these discussions, that not other members of the Canadian government were privy to this.
Yeah, so that sure is interesting. We know that these discussions happened several times and at the highest levels inside the military. When I put this information to our government here in Canada, the government said, look, we weren't directing these discussions, and we really don't have any interest in this high-end concept of a fully integrated force. So that leads to the question of whether or not the military was completely freelancing here. I'm going to give them a little bit of credit and suggest that really what they were doing was following along the line and the lines that had already been laid out for them through pieces like NORAD and through pieces like the NATO International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, and also really some of the work that Canada and other allies of the United States, France and the United Kingdom and others are doing in Iraq and Syria, for instance. There is this move toward integrated coalition forces. How do you make that work?
Interesting, yes, because I see in your reporting you say that the Defense Department says that the planning for this began as an attempt to maintain lessons learned from joint operations in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, I do have to wonder, how do Canadians react to this? Because I think, if I could just quote your own piece to you, very elegantly written, that this kind of bilateral relationship is described by some as akin to sharing a bed with an elephant.
Yeah, I have to give credit where it's due. That came from a former prime minister, a guy called Pierre Trudeau, and that was what he said, and that is the idea that we hold here in terms of our relationship, both economically as well as militarily. The reality is, when it comes to the military piece, Canada is a very small contributor, important but small contributor to the defense of North America. The defense of North America has become a really important thing for the United States following those horrible attacks in September of 2001, and the military response by the United States to create something like the U.S. NORTHCOM arrangement, the combatant command responsible for North America, that kind of swallowed up NORAD, which is this binational North American aerospace defense unit. That's really what led to this move to see if there might be further integration, for instance, at sea, in the defense of our maritime approaches, and then why not abroad? It seems that abroad piece is really the hardest one for people to come to grips with. The integration of land forces, right? There's so much esprit de corps inside these land units. You know about how somebody never really leaves the Marines. They're always a Marine for the rest of their life. And people are very proud of belonging to these units and to these organizations and fighting for their country. Those sorts of things. And this is why maybe in the long run the idea of a future Devil's Brigade probably isn't something that would ever come to be. But we are seeing things like the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, which has a few Nordic countries and Northern European countries linking up with the United Kingdom in order to come up with some kind of force of like-minded countries to go abroad and to fight abroad if necessary in order to kind of share the burden. It's really kind of like NATO in a tighter application, I suppose.
But just to be clear, at this point in time at least, fully integrating the U.S. and Canadian militaries is not on the table anymore.
That's what they say.
That's what they say, okay. Well, the question remains then. But finally, James, I'm curious, can you talk to us about the political aspects of this? Because Canada is gearing up for an election that could determine whether or not Prime Minister Stephen Harper remains as PM. I mean, how much is defense and national security part of the election there?
We are talking about some of these issues, national security, quite regularly on what's been a 12-week campaign coming to a close on October 19th. Ours are more limited duration than kind of the perennial campaign, or at least the years-long campaign for the White House that we see in the United States.
That's putting it gently. The interminable campaign is more like it.
And so the conversations are much more intense and more focused, and they happen over a smaller period of time. And we're hearing a lot of conversation around the idea of terrorism and protecting Canada, or the homeland, to use that American word, from terrorists, from people abroad. And it's probably important to remember that it wasn't that long ago, October 22nd, well, very nearly a year ago, that there was an attack in Ottawa by a lone terrorist, is the word that's been used, who attacked our parliament. Well, our prime minister and our ministers and all of our members of parliament were meeting inside the building in their separate caucus rooms. He also killed a soldier standing guard at the National War Memorial in Ottawa. So these ideas of sort of ISIS sympathizers, people who might be interested in doing harm to us in the name of the so-called Islamic State, is a live one over the course of our election campaign. But we don't have a very mature discussion of these issues in Canada during the electoral time frame. We're not talking about what a force should look like or what sort of operations somebody should be doing abroad. And indeed, since the election period began, we've heard very little from our own Department of National Defense about the war that we are currently fighting alongside the U.S. Against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria.
Well, James Cudmore is a senior reporter with the CBC's Parliamentary Bureau. James, many thanks.
You got it.
You're listening to Here and Now.
You can join Miami Light Project as they kick off their new season with hard-hitting jazz and infectious Cuban rhythms from Latin Grammy-nominated tenor saxophonist Carlos Everhoff Jr. in his latest musical project, I Resi, featuring alto saxophonist Greg Osby, pianist Arjuan Ortiz, drummer Francisco Mela, and bassist John Lockwood. October 9th and 10th at the Light Box at Goldman Warehouse. For more information, visit MiamiLightProject.com.
I'm Tim Padgett. All this week, WLRN Miami Herald News presents a series of reports from Honduras on the Central American migrant crisis and how the U.S. is confronting it. The migration maze is made possible by MBAF, CPAs and advisors.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and your NPR station. MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. And Olin College of Engineering, focusing on project and design-based education with the goal of inspiring the next generation of technical innovators needed to solve the world's challenges. Learn more at olin.edu.
This is Here and Now, and according to the latest report from the U.S. Drought Monitor, 99.86% of California is in some level of drought. 46% of the state is in the highest level of drought. Now, the good news is that Californians have cut their water use by 27% in the month of August. That is the third straight month that residents and businesses met the state's goals to cut water usage in the face of this 4-year drought. But even conservation would not help the giant sequoia trees in California's Sequoia National Park. Scientists have discovered that many of the trees, which have survived for centuries of drought, fire, and insect invasions, are showing visible signs of exhaustion. Anthony Ambrose is a tree biologist with the University of California, Berkeley. He actually climbs into the sequoias to place sensors and measure their health, and he joins us now. Anthony, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And for people who've never seen a giant sequoia tree, can you describe it for us?
Giant sequoia trees are one of the most amazing trees in the world. They are the largest organism in the world, not counting clonal species. They have these huge, massive orange trunks that just pop out from the landscape. They're way bigger than anything else growing around them. They have these big, massive, sprawling crowns with huge limbs, and they're hundreds of feet tall and thousands of years old. There's just these just beautiful, beautiful trees.
And I know that you and your team examined the sequoias in the Sierra Nevadas just a couple of weeks ago. What did you find? What's the update at this point?
Well, the giant sequoia trees over the last 2 years have been showing some signs of drought stress. They've been shedding a lot of foliage more than normal. Not all trees are showing these signs, but a lot of them are. And so we went and measured the water status of the trees and collected some leaf samples to analyze their chemical signatures, and found that a lot of the trees are quite stressed, more stressed than we've seen in the past. But it's highly variable, so some trees are showing signs of stress and some trees are not.
And are things still getting worse as compared to when you went up there, let's say in August?
Yeah, when we first started climbing the trees at the beginning of the summer, a lot of the trees that were not showing signs of stress were showing them later on in the season, when we went back for our measurements. We think that the shedding of the foliage is a mechanism that the trees are responding to the drought by reducing their leaf area that's losing water to the atmosphere.
And over the life of these trees, because these are very old trees, you're saying this has never happened in the past, or we just don't know?
Well, yeah, you're correct that these trees, they live thousands of years. They've undoubtedly dealt with pretty severe droughts in the past and other disturbances such as fires. But the level of foliage dieback that's being observed this year and last year has never been observed in the park's 125-year history. So it is definitely unusual, and there hasn't been any historical evidence of such an event like this in the past.
Is there anything that you could do to help them, to alleviate their stress, or does it just, we have to wait until it starts raining in California?
Well, the park is really interested in getting a better understanding of which trees on the landscape and which areas are more or less vulnerable to drought stress, because they can use that information to prioritize management activities such as prescribed fire, to thin out some of the understory trees and reduce some of the competition for limited soil water availability.
Is what's happening to the sequoias different than what's happening to any other tree in California? Would you be able to see this same kind of thing on a tree that doesn't live for 3,000 years?
Well, a lot of trees in California are really suffering from this current drought, and even within the giant sequoia groves, there are other species that are actually dying, pines and firs and cedars in particular in the Sierra Nevada, that are actually, there's whole swaths, particularly at lower elevations, that are actually dying. So, you know, they're more vulnerable to bark beetles and other types of pests that drought weakens the trees. The giant sequoias are tougher than these other species, so we're optimistic that they'll be able to hang through this where some of the other trees are dying.
What is it that you can learn from a giant sequoia that you can't learn from any other tree?
That's a good question. Well, you know, each species handles the environment and drought stress, in this example, differently. Different trees have different ways of coping and adapting to the environment and the conditions that they face. And so, you know, giant sequoias are a good example of a very tough and resistant tree, and being able to learn how they are able to deal with these types of events helps us understand how they can live for thousands of years and get to be so big and large.
Dr. Anthony Ambrose is a researcher with the University of California, Berkeley. He's been climbing up these giant sequoia trees in the Sierras to see how they're